Hey, welcome to Inexpert Film Advice. I'm Deontay Jenkins, and here's what's on my mind. Story structure, specifically the 3-act story structure. Let me break it down. Story structure is probably the most crucial part of storytelling, and yet it's the part that's most often glossed over. It's something that we as storytellers need to know in order to move the story along with momentum and in a way that the audience can understand and comprehend and be able to keep up with. This is the first in a series where I'll be presenting various story structures and showing you how they work and showing you how to use them to make your stories better. So I figured, why not start with the basic? The most commonly used and most easily accessible story structure is the 3-act story structure. It has a very clear beginning, middle, and end. The beginning sets up the conflict. The middle shows your protagonist battling against the conflict, and the end shows your protagonist giving one final push to overcome it. Here's how it should start. Let's make your film a timeline that starts here and ends here. For the first bit of your story, you need to establish your main character or your protagonist in their everyday life. It's important to show what's normal for them because by the end of the story, either the way they think, the way they act, the way they live, the way they interact with people, or the way their mindset is, will have to show some kind of change in order for there to be a story. Something has to happen to challenge them in what they know is normal. That's where the conflict comes. Without conflict, you have no story. Now, once you've done that, you've come to the inciting incident, which is here. This gets your story started. Something needs to happen to disrupt the normal that we've been establishing thus far in our story. Case study, Monsters Inc. Up until this point in the film, we've established a norm. The number one job in this monster world is scaring. The monsters scare because the screams help power their city. We've also established that Sully, one of our lead protagonists, is the number one scarer in this monster world.
Scarers like James P. Sullivan.
And we've also established that the same kids that power the city are considered toxic to the monsters, to the point where if anything they own touches you, you're considered a biohazard.
Brothers, 2319! We have a 2319!
Red alert! Red alert! Red alert! Red alert! Red alert!
A bit of an ironic twist seeing as the monsters need the kids to survive. So we've established the normal, the number one job in the monster world is scaring. Sully is the best scarer in the monster world, and kids are considered toxic to the monsters. Now all of this sets up the inciting incident. We as an audience know what the normal is, so when this happens, we know something is wrong. Introducing a new character is a great way to present an inciting incident. In this instance, the character is so against the norm and so feared that it disrupts what our main character is used to. And because of this, there's no way things can go back to the way they were before. The inciting incident should separate the first half of the first act and the second half. The first half establishes the world of the protagonist, and in the second half, they're reacting to the inciting incident. Now the story has begun and our protagonist has something to do, or at least they have something to react to. The inciting incident has put them in a predicament, and now they have to do something about it. This is what's called the call to adventure, or the call to action. The decision to act upon this new disruption or not needs to happen. And yes, your protagonist can choose whether to act or not. There's no wrong answer. It really depends on what story you're telling and what kind of character you're building. Case study. Luke finds out about what's going on with Leia and the Rebel Alliance and is presented with the opportunity to become a Jedi like his father before him. But instead of accepting the call to action, he chooses to run from it. Which brings us to the first plot point. The first plot point forces our protagonist into action whether they want to or not. Sticking with Star Wars, the first plot point takes Luke back home to find out that his aunt and uncle have been murdered by the Empire. And it's only then that he decides to go along with Obi-Wan and become a Jedi. If the inciting incident gets your story started, the first plot point gets your character development started. It's where we get the first taste of who they will become. And how they react to the first plot point is a clear indication of where they're headed in the story. And that wraps up the first act. First we establish the normal, then we establish the disruption of the normal, and then we establish where the character is going. Which brings us to the meat of the story, the second act. The second act is where the majority of things happen in your story. Now let's continue with the reaction to the first plot point. Now typically what causes the first plot point is the antagonistic force, or what your protagonist is fighting against. In Monsters Inc. this will be Randall, and in Star Wars this will be the Empire. And just as they're starting to understand what they're up against comes the first pinch point. The first pinch point is a reminder or a realization of just how strong the antagonistic force working against them is. It provides new information about the nature of the conflict. Case study, The Departed. Billy Costigan is an undercover police officer trying to infiltrate a criminal organization led by Frank Costello. The first plot point comes when Billy manages to get Frank's attention and get into the criminal organization. His reaction to that comes when he's forced to wear a wire. From there, we see where the character is going and the fear and paranoia that's brought to him from having to spy on Frank. Simultaneously, we have another plot point going that is equally as important. Colin is also an undercover cop, only he's a double agent. He's a mole placed there by Frank. We see him feeding information to Frank and working to undermine the investigation against him. And that's where we get to the first pinch point. The first pinch point comes when Billy finds out that there's a mole in the cops, and when Colin finds out that there's a rat amongst Frank's men. Essentially, they find out about each other. The pinch point is a turning point for our protagonist. In fact, each point on the storyline should be a turning point for our lead characters, having more significance than the last. To paraphrase Robert McKee, there has to be changes in values for our characters in order to present conflict and catharsis. Changes in values meaning human experiences that can go from positive to negative or negative to positive at any moment. Love, hate, free slave, happy, sad are all examples of basic exchanges in value. Hope, despair would be a more complex example of one. Neither are tangible things, but you know what it's like to feel both. You need to have these changes in values in order for your audience to feel that your character is going through something, and then the tension from that something is being released. Now, in The Departed, this is an example of a more complex one. Both Billy and Colin feel what they're doing is going well until they find out that there is a spy working against them.
There was a leak from the inside. It's real, man. Smoke him out.
Yeah, how do we do that, Mr. Fucking Genius who didn't even graduate from the academy?
Now they're trying to make sure that they can stay safe while still doing their job. Now, moving on from there, our protagonist is presented with new information and reacts accordingly. It's really important that your protagonist reacts to the new information based on the situation that it puts them in. From there, they get their footing again and again react accordingly. Your protagonist should have a brief moment where things are looking up and they feel a bit more confident moving against the antagonistic force. Sticking with The Departed, both Billy and Colin are going hard at their goals now, trying to achieve them before something bad happens, and it looks like they possibly can. But this is just a setup for what's about to happen next, and what's about to happen next is a doozy, the midpoint. I like to see the midpoint as a second inciting incident. It takes your story and sends it in a completely different direction. Typically, it's a really big false victory or a really bad crushing defeat. Case study, The Dark Knight. At the midpoint of The Dark Knight, the Joker has been arrested and Commissioner Gordon is alive and well. And now the audience has no idea where the story is going to go. We later find out that the Joker's arrest is a false victory. He wanted to be captured. Like I said, the midpoint is typically a false victory or a crushing defeat. But sometimes it could be a completely unforeseen twist. Case study, Psycho. At the midpoint of Psycho, our lead protagonist has been murdered. Now, if you think the audience doesn't know where the story is going when our lead antagonist has been captured, think about how they feel when the lead protagonist has been murdered. The goal at the midpoint is to leave the audience wondering, where do we go from here? Before, we spoke about changes in values, and we do that to have momentum going in our story. But we also do that to keep the audience wondering. Nobody wants their audience to be wondering when the story ends, or predicting what happens next. Each change in values should leave the audience wondering what's going to happen next, but the midpoint should do that to the extreme. You don't want to lose your audience midway through your story. Now, following that, a protagonist gets a little bit of leeway against the antagonist. If at the midpoint it was a false victory, here's where your protagonist finds out. In The Dark Knight, this is the interrogation scene. And from there, we reach our second pinch point. The second pinch point brings our protagonist to the lowest of lows, showing our antagonist power against them. We all know what happens next in The Dark Knight, so I'll take you to a different superhero movie. Case study, Logan. After staying with the nice family in the middle of nowhere, a clone of Logan comes and kills the family and Charles. Logan and Laura barely make it out of there alive. This moment needs to raise the stakes and give the audience and the protagonist a reason to invest more. For the audience, it's the fact that there's a younger, better, stronger version of Logan. For Logan, it's the fact that one of his long-term friends has died at the hands of this clone. It makes things a lot more personal for us and for Logan. It gives us even more of a reason to root for the protagonist's success. Following this, the protagonist typically feels down and out. In Logan, we see him give up on everything. That is until he gets a renewed push by Laura and the rest of the kids.
Funny. That is not funny. Hey, pal. How long have I been out?
And then finally we get to the third plot. The midpoint is the second plot point, by the way. Here's when things don't go quite right and your protagonist's renewed push against the antagonist. Case study, Django Unchained. This comes after Django has entered a gunfight with the Candyland crew, as I like to call them, and he's sent to the LaQuint-Dickey mining company. For another example, going back to Star Wars, this would be when Ben dies. Things have come to a halt and it doesn't seem like our protagonist can move forward. And yet, somehow they do. Django outsmarts the people transporting him and makes his way back to Candyland. Luke gets a little pep talk from Leia and takes down some Imperial scum. The hard times that they have found themselves in, they need to find themselves out. And that's where the climax comes. It's Luke blowing up the Death Star, it's Batman versus the Joker, it's Django coming back and killing everybody in Candyland. It's the most exciting part of your story and where everything has been building up until this point. It's Logan versus Clone Logan, it's finding out who Norman's mom really is in Psycho. Now, just because your protagonist makes one final push against the antagonistic force doesn't mean that they succeed. The point isn't for them to succeed, it's for them to try. In The Departed, Billy most certainly does not succeed. I won't go too deep into that just in case you haven't seen it. Acting against your antagonistic force is what the story is about. And in the 3-act structure, we see them go as far as they can against the antagonistic force. And finally, after the climax, we have the resolution. Much like the introduction, this is where we establish the new normal. This is the show where the journey has led your protagonist. Now, this doesn't have to be long. I've seen it last for less than a minute before in films. We just need to show that our story has gone somewhere and something has happened and changed since the beginning. And that, my friends, is the 3-act story structure. If you learn it, your stories will automatically become more understandable and flow better. Doesn't mean you'll write good stories, but they'll definitely flow better. But then again, what do I know? I'm no expert. So what did you think of this quick breakdown of the 3-act story structure? Let me know in the comments below. Like I said, this is the first in a series of story structure breakdowns, so definitely hit that subscribe button if you want to see more. Make sure you ring the bell to be notified of when anything is being uploaded. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, you can follow me on social media here if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, and to find out what the movie of the day is. For those of you who don't know, I watch a movie of the day, and you can join me, and we can have discussions about it. But you have to follow me on social media to know what that movie is. That is all I have for you today. Hopefully this 3-act story structure breakdown helped you out a little bit. Once again, I am Deontay Jenkins, and I'll see you next time. Peace.